electric area in which you are, and you use that information to decide the ways and means of operating. It's very important that we send a message and give a commitment to the industry and to governments so that they see that Europe too can develop in that direction, because that could help us to have more frequencies available for new mobile broadband users. The multi-annual program should also include some things which are important for the short term. There are European practices about access to mobile telecommunication services. There are facilities of access for those services which local authorities issue at the moment. At the moment, some local authorities don't want to issue licenses for the use of these technologies. And consequently, they generate public fears about the health risk from exposure to radiation. And these local difficulties create uncertainties in certain areas of Europe. And that means, because of these different views, you can get signal coverage in some places and not in others. So it would be a good idea to have harmonization and for the European institutions to be sending a clear message. A clear message to be understood by local authorities about how there is no evidence at the moment of any negative impact from exposure to radio exposure to radio waves within the limits already established by the European Union. Last thing which I think would be important to put into this multi-annual program would be a study of the situation of digital radio in Europe. It should be possible to standardize that, to encourage digitalization of radio in those European countries where it's not moving at the moment for want of clearer guidelines. As to Spain, one of our telecommunications objectives ever since the start has been effective use, efficient use of the spectrum, and to encourage investment and innovation and the development of new electronic services and networks. In community terms, Spain's position has always been favorable to the new directives which were debated and then finally approved in November. In fact, even before those directives passed, Spain had passed in June 2009 a new regulation on the use of the radio electric spectrum, and that included a good many things which were still then at the stage of proposals for changes to the European regulatory framework. This Spanish regulation, for example, included a secondary spectrum market with the possibility of total transfer of the license or partial transfer of a license, and the possibility of handing over spectrum use rights, of transferring them. And there was also technological neutrality and service neutrality for the use of certain bandwidths in the spectrum. A public register of holders of private rights to use the spectrum was set up, accessible on the internet, to make the management of the resource more transparent, and administrative barriers were reduced that were obstacles to access to the resource. There were also arrangements for this secondary market and technological and service neutrality for those to come in gradually in bandwidths. It was, in other words, established for some bandwidths already, with an open door to further bandwidths being added in the future. One of our main purposes has been to make available to citizens more of the spectrum. We're looking now to find frequency bands which are technologically adequate for electronic services, electronic communication services. As I said before, we're looking at making the spectrum use more flexible, and even making it possible to share it without there being interference, of course. On top of the existing technological neutrality, the so-called, we're thinking of the refarming, as it's called, of the 900 and 1100 megahertz bands, and we are making the 2.5 gigahertz and 3.5 gigahertz bands available under the conditions already